Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Organizing the Green New Deal free course. We are on class number 4 today, and we are joined by the wonderful Camila Bustos. And I'm going to do just like a quick introduction for her and then pass it on to her for presentation. I think she's going to present for a little bit, and then we'll move into a Q&A. So Camila is on our board, which we're very excited about. She's also at Yale Law School right now, just about to graduate and onto an exciting clerkship. And she's worked at a Colombian NGO called De Justicia that does climate-induced displacement and the business of human rights regime. She's also been involved with groundbreaking lawsuits against Colombian government for failing to meet its deforestation targets and a whole bunch of really other amazing stuff. She's going to tell us today about climate migration. So please bring your good questions, and then I'll pass it over here and we'll go from there. Welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Nick, and everyone who's behind putting this amazing class together. I'm really excited to be here. I'm gonna try to share my screen now. Is that working? Great, awesome. So just so folks know a little bit where I'm coming from in terms of my background, I focus mostly on climate change issues, international climate politics, did some fossil fuel divestment work. Then, as Nick mentioned, worked in Colombia on climate litigation issues. And then I started to really get into climate-induced displacement research and trying to understand how is it that climate and migration interact. We looked briefly at case in Colombia, in Gramalote. Happy to talk about that. But today's chat will focus a bit more, obviously, on the United States, things that we can incorporate in a Green New Deal or immigration policy generally. And then I've done immigration work in law school as part of a clinic on immigrant rights, worker rights, focusing on helping, DACA recipients. Been part of the case one of the many cases that was brought when the Trump administration terminated DACA. So been involved through that case, as well as work trying to stop the removal of a mother from the U.S. and a few asylum and some asylum work. So that's just my background, so folks know. I know more about climate than I know about immigration, but have recently worked at the intersection of and separately on those two issues. So let me see. So just I want to give a quick note on terminology. I feel like this when you look at press articles or notes on climate migration, I think it's gotten better, but it used to be very much about like a crisis of climate refugees coming into the global north, coming to the United States, going to Europe, et cetera, et cetera. And I just wanna be careful as like a law student, future lawyer about the terminology we use. I will try to avoid using the word refugee unless I'm exactly referring to people who have claims under the Refugee Convention, who may be able to apply for asylum. There's, I think, also people use the word migrant, which doesn't have a precise definition under international law. Different organizations use migrant for different purposes. There's also I use displacement or induced displacement. I like it more because it talks about climate change as something that is causing people to leave their homes in a way that's forcible. They're not deciding to migrate necessarily or to move necessarily. So I like displacement for the reason climate-induced, and not just climate, because climate is only one of many factors that shape someone's decision to migrate, and we can talk more about that, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But just so you know, that's kind of the terminology I'm using, climate-induced displacement. But generally, I think you might hear me say migrants or something like that. I'm happy to talk more about that later as well. So here are some projections. Obviously, this depends a lot on what kind of carbon trajectory we're on, kind of mitigation, actions we seriously take or not take globally. But some of the estimates predict that 200 million people will move or migrate by 2050 because of climate change. I think this number is coming from the World Bank, if I'm not mistaken. And again, why? Because climate change, as we know, is causing all sorts of devastating impacts, from extreme weather events to worsening gradual environmental degradation, the sinking of coastal zones, sea level rise. I know the audience is really familiar, so I don't want to spend too much time here, but I think what's important for us to know is that what climate does is amplify existing stressors and vulnerability. And that's what happens. That's what makes people decide to either move internally or across borders. And I want us to focus specifically too. The project I'm currently working on is focused on the Northern Triangle region in Central America. So this is Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador specifically. And I'm working on this project as part of a broader project with the University Network of Human Rights, where I'm an associate, as well as with some colleagues from Harvard Law School. And essentially, we're trying to understand what is going on. What do experts tell us about climate migration from Central America, and what can the US do about it? So again, in the Central American context, as with any other context, it's not just climate, right? We know that there's a complicated history in the region, partly and driven by the United States and intervention from the United States. But we know that the last few decades have seen an unprecedented level of gang violence, gender-based violence, economic instability, and right before the pandemic, we saw like unprecedented numbers, especially of unaccompanied minors and families crossing the border. So clearly, climate is coming into a context where there's already a lot of different factors that are shaping people's lives and decisions, if we want to call them that, to migrate. So the challenges when we talk about climate migration is precisely something I think I hinted at, which is that there currently is no international protection for people who are forced to leave because of climate change. We have the Refugee Convention. It's an international law instrument that was developed and signed by states in 1951 after World War II, but it's very limited. For the lawyers in the room, they'll know that there's 5 grounds for protection: race, nationality, ethnicity, etc. And essentially, an asylum seeker has to argue that they're persecuted on one of those grounds. So climate, clearly, in 1951 wasn't on the mind of the drafters. And currently, there's a lot of people who think that, well, there's some people who think we should just revise it and add climate or environmental factors. I think there's people who don't want to do that because of increasing xenophobia and nationalism we've seen around the world. And so the fear that it would actually weaken the Refugee Convention and weaken the few protections that exist. So that is a conversation that's happening, especially, I think it happened a few years, especially among scholars, but realistically, the odds of revising the convention are very small. So as I said, lack of will and among states, there's always the fear of setting a precedent. We see this a lot in the climate negotiations, where states are unwilling to pay for reparations, for climate reparations, or we can use different words to refer to that, but essentially reparations in some way to help global South countries deal with the damage of climate change, and limited funding, right? So there's limited funding for specific projects, but also for different international institutions that currently deal with immigration or migration generally. The second challenge when we talk about climate migration is multicausality. And I hinted at this when I was talking about climate-induced displacement as opposed to climate displacement. So we know that climate change is making extreme weather events more intense, more frequent, but we also can't tell at this very moment that climate change caused one particular event. So if we talk about Hurricane Sandy, we know climate change made it worse than it would have been, but we can't say at this precise moment that it was caused by climate change. There is something called Attribution Science, which is really exciting, and I think is looking at the future of a lot of the climate litigation work, and it's basically looking at the ways in which maybe a particular event can be traced to certain emissions from certain countries or a particular period in time, but it's at its early stages, and it's not widely available to us right now. So when we talk about climate-induced displacement, we have to talk about climate as, again, another factor, sometimes the triggering factor that exacerbates economic vulnerability that exacerbates vulnerability based on other social factors, gender, race, etc. And so that is why conceptually for a lot of people, it's really hard to talk about climate migration or climate-induced displacement, because for a lot of scholars who especially maybe are very familiar with the Refugee Convention and asylum claims, it's like we cannot say that climate was the single cause that led to someone's decision to, or to someone's movement. And so again, I don't think that should be like obviously an obstacle for us to like think about solutions and how to help people to migrate with dignity, but it is conceptually, I think it makes it more difficult than with other types of movement or displacement. And lastly, I'll say that I think the other really, there are many challenges, but the other third challenge I want to highlight is this discourse on security and the focus on national security. And folks have talked about this in the first sessions of the class, so I don't want to emphasize this point too much, but it is true that currently when we talk about, or we see press coverage or countries putting forth proposals on how to deal with climate migration, it's often not from a human rights lens. It's often not through the lens of dignity. It's through the lens of like security and national security and like the implications of having brown and black bodies coming through the border. So let's just keep that in mind. So this is exactly what I was talking about, is this idea that and it is a legacy of colonial stereotypes that, that essentially are shifting the blame to migrants, and are totally depoliticizing the real causes of displacement. The years of war that could have been caused by many times U.S. intervention, or the different types of violence that exist against women or indigenous people. So again, I think we have to be cautious when we talk about climate displacement or climate migration, because although it's important and we need to talk about it, it can often be done in a way that's, I think, problematic. I also just want to say that, yes, there are these huge numbers that are thrown in as millions of people coming by 2050. And at the same time, most migration will happen internally within countries. It's not, it's not easy for someone to just leave their home. And so I just want to like emphasize that as well. Like I'm focusing here a lot on cross-border movement, but a lot of the migration will be internal. Like for instance, I come from Colombia, which is a country that's incredibly vulnerable to climate change. And natural disasters have been a part of our history for forever, since I remember. Every year there's like landslides that displace tons of people, sometimes permanently, sometimes temporarily. And the reality is that most people just like move internally within the country, and if they can't return to their place of origin, they usually do. So this is a really complex, we're talking about a really, really complex situation, where, sometimes people will relocate internally, especially move towards urban areas in a country, and then eventually face another factor that makes them actually leave the country. But again, this is not particularly easy, especially in the current context where our border is militarized and where we have like increasing nationalism and xenophobia. So just want to highlight that as well. So when we talk about climate migration too, especially from Central America, I think we have to connect the dots. And I talked about this briefly, but I think for those who work in the region and who are, or who are from the region, no, this is no secret. This is like, just like what they have always known. But the reality is that I don't think in the U.S., especially, I think public education in the U.S. doesn't really talk about the ways in which foreign policy has really, really devastated many countries in Latin America and in the global South. My region of focus is Latin America, but in Central America specifically, there's so much literature that has documented the ways in which the United States has really, really fueled a lot of the violence we see today. And so I really love this Guardian article that talks about why is it that people are fleeing to the United States in the first place? It's not because they just want to, and right, there's obviously all sorts of underlying political, economic, social reasons. And so I just invite you to read that. It's quite a short read. It's really good. There's also the article that was in the readings by Professor Gonzalez. And she talks about climate change, and she talks about immigration as reparations, and I really like that framework. And she again, what she does is connect the dots and say, look, this is what we did in the 1980s. This is what we've done, throughout history. It's like really like the so-called war on drugs, right? Like militarized training. We also deported a lot of people into Central America without telling those governments we were going to deport those people and who those people were. And so a lot of there's, I'm not an expert in this, but folks are. And so I think it's important when we talk about climate change and migration that we also remember this history, because it's central to understanding where we are now. There's another professor at Chume who's at UCLA, brilliant, and she talks about migration as decolonization. And I won't do justice to her argument, please read her paper, but essentially she talks about this idea that, the first and the third world have been in relationship with each other for, since colonialism and the development of, the current capitalist system, and so that these relationships are clearly asymmetrical and equal and clearly have had long-lasting impacts. And she talks about migration as one of the ways in which the global north could try to I don't know if she uses the word reparation, but could try to, like, in some ways ameliorate historical inequities and sort of be held accountable through by letting people in, essentially, because these relationships have always existed. Again, I'm not doing justice to her argument, but I invite you to look at it. And I think the framework is helpful. It also seems almost like counterintuitive at points, and I do think there's the narratives about migration can often be like disempowering and can often like place people who migrate as victims. And so I like the idea of like actually using migration as like an empowering tool. And again, for those of us who are in the north, in the global north, like really like hold ourselves accountable for what it means, for us to like be enjoying the benefits of like colonialism and like imperialism. So I think it's a helpful framework. So just I'm about to end here because I want to really hear from y'all, questions, thoughts. I'm sure there's like tons of experts in the room too on all of these issues, but for me, I think we need to approach these issues through a human rights framework. That's what I think is the baseline. Like, how do we protect people's human rights, and how do we allow them, if they have to move, to do so with dignity? The first thing, obviously, mitigation. I mean, I don't have to tell anyone in this class like the importance of that. A 3 degree warmer world is very different than a world that's 6 degrees warmer, right? And I think for those of us, I think it's obvious, but for a lot of people, it's not. I do encounter a lot of people who are like, okay, we're kind of screwed with climate. And it's like, actually, no, we're not. And like, it's very different. Like a world 1 degree warmer is very different. So I think we can't lose the focus on mitigation. And at the same time, we know that we're locked into certain impacts, and that especially people, in the global south that are vulnerable because both they are many of them geographically located in areas that, are just more exposed to like extreme weather events and other types of environmental impacts. And, are economically and socially vulnerable. Like we need help. We need people to adapt. And again, I'm talking about global south, but I think obviously this is true inside the United States. Like, and so I think that is something that we talk about, and sometimes we talk about it, especially like in the global south. But I think adaptation is where we want to go to prevent people from having to leave home in the first place. Again, this is not something people want to do. But then, as a last resort, I do think we need migration plans. We need like a planned migration. We need to ensure that domestic policies are allowing people who are forced to leave to be able to do so in a way that doesn't violate their human rights, and in a way that reflects and holds us accountable for like our historical role, both in creating and causing and fueling the climate crisis, but also, as I mentioned, in like really destabilizing a lot of these regions. And so how do we think about planned migration as a way to migration as adaptation is actually used by some scholars who do this work to talk about, again, the idea that it doesn't have to be as traumatic. It doesn't have to be, if we are able to like use our resources and use time and be time and plan plan carefully. And again, there's tons of lessons from practitioners and scholars who have worked on resettlement and relocation. There's a lot of literature on like relocation and resettlement from natural disasters, but also we know there's plenty of other reasons why people move and what works and what doesn't in particular scenarios. So we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel here. I think we should draw from those lessons. And I guess I'll just end here with some of the things that our report looks at. We haven't launched it yet, but it's essentially looking at what the Biden administration can do. And so some of you might have seen there was an executive action. I'm forgetting the exact number, but that essentially tasks different agencies to come up with a report that looks at climate migration in 180 days or so. And so it's very exciting. I think it's the first time an administration has taken action like right, in the first 100 days on climate migration. And at the same time, we know it's not enough. Like this is a first step, but like we need to take we need to take action. And so some of the things here, I didn't include all of the legalese, but essentially currently, I don't think there's anything in our immigration law or policies that can help us deal appropriately and adequately with the climate crisis and its impacts on immigration. That said, there are already existing programs, there are existing vehicles that have allowed people to remain in the United States because, of earthquakes or hurricanes, that sort of thing. I'm talking about Temporary Protected Status Program, TPS, for those in the class who know it. And again, it's been very small scale. And it's usually focused on rapid onset events. So these disasters that, catch our eye and there's like massive coverage and then we kind of forget about, but we haven't really talked about slow onset weather events. And so the fact that, sea level rise is one of those things that from one day to the other, we won't see people having to leave their home, but we know it's happening. And we actually haven't, integrated it into like the way, like the reasons why people leave and what we should do about it. So that's one of the recommendations. Again, some of the programs that I mentioned, like TPS, actually protect people who have left, but who are already here. And that's a huge barrier because then what happens to everyone else who hasn't, been able to cross the border and enter the United States. There's ideas and proposals around a new climate visa. There's been legislation on the creation of, introduced, not passed, to create, a new category for climate displaced person. We can talk about that too. And again, I'm not an asylum expert, but folks have been advocating for integrating climate change in the current asylum framework. Some people have said that, again, we need to revise the Refugee Convention. Some people say, actually, you don't. Within the current existing framework, there's space to talk about climate change and to bring climate change because it exacerbates, persecution on some of the other grounds. So again, happy to maybe talk about that. And finally, again, we have an idea with their estimates. Increasingly, we see more and more reports. Hopefully, some of you saw the New York Times amazing report on climate migration, but we still don't really know, right? And those estimates change so much depending on how rapidly or slowly we mitigate emissions, how well prepared countries are, and so all sorts of factors that experts need to integrate into those projections. But we need more research to be able to know what's happening. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and that was a lot of information. So I'm just going to stop talking for a little bit and see and read the chat and see what people thought.
Chat's quiet so far, and so I'll take some moderator privileges here to pepper you with questions for a little bit. And folks, feel free to ask questions in the chat. I really, the first 3 sessions here, we've talked a lot about kind of like history and how things have come to be, and sometimes going way back, sometimes going into the recent past. But you had mentioned that, U.S. policy in Central America and Latin America has already fueled a lot of forced migration or economic displacement. And, one of the best examples of that I know was like NAFTA as like a way of opening up markets and basically taking a lot of land that was governed or was farmed by people as who are just like living on the land off of it, and centralizing ownership of land, and then sort of like incentivizing people have to go to somewhere to find economic opportunities, and then kind of, you know, US policy being hostile to that on one hand, but also being like really open to it, and a lot of industries more or less like surviving on off the books labor from people who are like immigrating and the rest. And so just one example of just like a big economic sort of like transition that caused people to be displaced. And I wonder if you want to talk about that a little bit more, like what in your experience are some of the past major policy changes or approaches in Latin America that have really moved that? And then maybe how do you see that as, like, how do you see the attitudes of you know, people in the United States over time, those sort of like changing in response to that? So like you have the policy, and then you kind of have the reaction to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess I'll start by saying, and this is something that I only learned, you know, like a few years ago. Again, I'm you know, I'm starting my career on this issue, so but by no means an expert. But it is true that, you know, we know borders are like a recent creation, right? Like we know borders haven't always been here. They're not like the normal state or like the natural state of how we should organize society. And we know that, you know, Mexico and the United States in particular have had very rich, very complicated history, where, you know, eventually large parts of Mexico were taken by the United States after the Mexican-American War. And we know that what happened was that communities living along the border kept what we see the border kept moving, you know, and back and forth, because sometimes they would come to work to the United States and then they would go back home. They would send remittances but come back to work to the United States. And so that was like the natural flow of things for a long time, until, you know, we started to pass these policies that militarize the border, that increase like national security by strengthening the border. And what that did was that like that sort of undermine like this natural movement of people following economics, as you said, right? Like where are the jobs? People are going to go follow the jobs, and then they want to go back home. It's not like people just want to live in the United States because it's such a great country. I mean, there's many great things about it, but economically, I mean, that's why I came here too, right? Like there's economic pull. People talk about this as pull and push factors, right? So it's a pull factor. And I think it was during the Reagan administration that severe Immigration Act changes that actually prevented a lot of people from doing what they were doing before. So what ended up happening is that we see a huge spike in undocumented population, because it was people who like, well, at one point it was people who like couldn't just go back, or if they went back, then they were deemed, you know, like not legible by the state, or like undocumented or whatever, or illegal aliens, as is the term. So I just want to say that first, because I think we take borders for granted, and we take the idea that there's like a right way and a wrong way to enter, and a right way of like existing on Earth, and I just find that incredibly problematic for so many reasons. You know, I think, again, I'm not an expert on like U.S. imperialism in Latin America, but I know that, for instance, in Colombia, one of the things that the U.S. government really helped in previous administrations was fuel tons of money to do aerial fumigation of coca plants. And so what ended up happening is that farmers who had also their crops for, I don't know, potatoes, or, you know, just subsisting crops in many cases, would be totally devastated, because now you have like literally poison falling from the sky, thank you to the US government. And that actually caused a lot of people you know, to get sick, to develop tons of like medical problems, and many of them, I think, to internally also move around the country. I want to talk about briefly that there's also another trend, again, fueled by the United States and the right-wing governments in Colombia, where people, I mean, we after Syria, we have the second largest number of internally displaced persons on Earth, because of the internal conflict. And again, a conflict that was, it's very complicated, not going to get into it, more than 50 years, but a conflict that was in many ways shaped by US intervention. And many of those people ended up coming to the United States, right? On asylum, through refugee status, many of them undocumented, many of them, like myself, economic migrants, who in some way or another are still escaping the conflict that has like really had tremendous economic impacts, right? Like imagine the amount of money that the defense department in Colombia, defense ministry, has had to pour on like a 50-year plus conflict that didn't go into health, didn't go into education, didn't go into like land reform or helping people acquire land. So it's all very connected. And I think that's why I like so much the Gonzalez piece that's in the readings, because I think she does a really good job of connecting the, like you think about, like war on drugs, and you're like, what does that have to do with climate immigration? Why are we talking about the war on drugs? But it clearly has everything to do with climate migration, right? So that's one example in Colombia. Again, I'm not an expert in terms of what happened in the 80s. There's people who have documented this. I mean, Noam Chomsky, my boss Jim Cavallaro has a book on this, but we know that, again, and the Guardian piece is, I think, really good for that reason, because it's short, but it does a good historical summary. We also know that the war on drugs in Central America has had horrible impacts. We also know that the United States government trained a lot of the military in those countries that then, went to commit human rights violations against their citizens. And again, as I was mentioning, we know that they deported, like, I don't know if hundreds or thousands of people without telling. At this point, they hadn't told the government in that country, like, oh, by the way, we're deporting X person who has this background. Like, it was just done because, there's it's one of those things that the US does when they need to show that, things are getting serious and scary, and so we're just going to deport a bunch of people and look at us being so like mano dura, right? So like strong on immigration. And obviously that had like huge impacts on like what are small economies that have generally been, like campesino economies, and then have had to deal with their own set of like historical challenges around like corruption and poor like distribution of land and resources, like high inequality. So maybe I'm just rambling at this point, but again, I think it is all connected, which I think goes to your question. And so we have to think about internally what these countries are going through in their own national context, and then how it is that U.S. intervention, either through things like coups, which in Latin America there's been several, or through like just aid and military support, have actually like exacerbated the reasons why there's violence in those countries, and why people are economically unsafe or don't have the means to, or why is it that they're attracted by these pull factors of U.S. economic growth and stability in some ways.
Yeah, that's great. And part of the reason why, we front loaded a lot of, even though there are folks internationally participating in this class, I think a good amount of people are American. And so some history of the United States, I think, is warranted. And it also goes to what you had mentioned in passing around seeing climate-induced migration as a potential issue for an argument around reparations, and understanding history there and being able to connect the dots and causation seems really, really important in making that argument moving forward as well. We've got some questions from the audience here, and I'm just going to I'll go one by one. So Matthew says, can you say more? He says, hey, this is great. First of all, incredible presentation. Can you say more about the role of the collective right to self-determination in the governance of climate-induced relocation? To what extent is this principle enshrined in international law?
This is a great question. If I'm not wrong, this is enshrined in the Declaration of Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And it's often actually used by governments to prevent, and I think this was mentioned in your talk, Nick, with Jay and Danny. It's often used by governments who don't want international intervention, right? Because of their own human rights violations or their own environmental destruction. And so self-determination, I think, can be used for multiple purposes. But I think in theory, and I think the question is like talking about this, is how is it related to the issues we're discussing? And so again, the closest example I can think of is in Colombia. It's a town that we looked at. It's called Gramalote, and it was like the poster child of climate migration in Colombia, because the president actually referred to it as like, this is the first town that has been displaced by climate change. Again, even though because even though we're in a country where there's like landslides every year, like thousands of people like have to move because of natural disasters, right? But the whole issue became like a political campaign where the president said, I'm going to rebuild you a new town. And this is going to be wonderful. And again, trying to be, for political purposes. Long story short, it took over more than 10 years for the Colombian government to get it together and build this new town for people. And at that point, people, people who were 15 were 25, people who were 40 were 50, right? Like people had gone through, like people were in a different stage in their lives. And many of them didn't want to go back to the town. It was located in a nearby area. It wasn't the exact same location. It was quite vulnerable to climate impacts, but it wasn't, there was a lot of back and forth because a lot of what the experts were telling the town that should be done or how it should be built wasn't done with people from the town. Some of it was, there were, at some point, there was even people from McKinsey going into like rural Colombia to tell them how they should build their town, which from my voice, you can hear my skepticism. But, and I think that goes to the question of self-determination, because I think that if from the very beginning, the project would have really, really and genuinely involved the people who live there, I don't think they would have built it the way they did. The houses were incredible. People had like, access to things that they had never had before, more bathrooms or sanitation, things they hadn't necessarily had before. But people didn't want to live there because it didn't look like, either because they were, in a different stage of their lives, or because it didn't look like the way it did before. And so, like, for instance, like there were people who told us in interviews, like, but I'm not next to the neighbor that I was next to. And that was important for me because that was like part of like how I lived my life in that town. It was the fact that I had this person as my neighbor, this other person, right? And obviously when the government reconstructed the town, that was not part of the design because it was better, right? It was more technological. It was just, so I think that for me is like a perfect example of how I think the right to self-determination of many of those people was actually not respected. And I think it has to be, especially when we're talking about relocation and like people starting their own lives, and like how is it that we can develop programs that center their voices and center their needs? Because who is going to know better how to reconstruct like the social fabric of that community than themselves, right? So thank you for your question. I hope I answered some of it.
Awesome. This question is from Shri. Given that international law will likely not be revised to include climate-induced displacement, what do you think is the best way to compel countries, including the US, to consider climate in their asylum, refugee, or immigration policies?
Wow, Shri, this question is a lot and currently what's on my mind. How do you get a powerful country to do something that is seemingly against their interests, right? And I think there's like an activist answer to this and like a lawyer answer to this or like a practitioner answer to this. I mean, as a practitioner, I think the answer is you have to do it because it actually will benefit you in many, many ways. So we know that there's we know migration is going to happen. We know it's happening, and it's going to happen no matter what. And so in terms of how do we prepare for it, we are better suited, and we will be in a better spot if we actually prepare for it, if we actually put money into the science, understand what's happening, and then develop the programs necessary to help people. Many of those programs exist, right? Like we like asylum law is not new. After the past administration, we're in a different place because the Trump administration basically dismantled the asylum system as we know it, among other really, really tragic changes to immigration law, which wasn't great to begin with, right? So that tells you a little bit of where we're at. But I think we have to so that's, I guess that's my lawyer answer. It's like we try to like talk to people who are developing policy or who are trying to pass immigration law, which right now there's been several bills introduced, and we talk to them about the importance of including climate, the importance for national security reasons. Although as you heard me initially, like if you were with us. Like, I don't love that particular discourse as like an activist and as someone and as a human rights, like, and as a human, period. Like, I don't think the national security discourse is productive. Femi has written on this, many others have written on this. But as an activist, I think you push for all the moral reasons that we've discussed and for all the historical reasons we've discussed, right? And actually, the United States, especially under Trump, I mean, reduced its refugee cap. I don't remember the exact numbers, but like, we stopped really accepting. We already didn't accept that many people, and then we stopped accept for the size of the country, right? Like, how big we are, how big our economy is, geographically, the scale of the country, and we decreased that number drastically during the Trump administration, and now the Biden-Harris administration has said that it has increased the cap again, which I think is, again, one step in the right direction. But I think we have to play different strategies as activists. I think we have to push again. I think we're in the right here, right? Like, we have the moral arguments and the historical arguments that have hinted at, or not hinted at, that I've discussed throughout the presentation. So hopefully that answered your question. I think it's a really tricky question, and that's something that I'm currently really thinking about. We're going to be meeting with some staffers from Congress to try to talk about the report and try to figure out what's the current landscape. As I said, there's been some legislation introduced by Senator Markey and Representative Velasquez on this. It was introduced last Congress, creating, a category for climate displaced persons. Again, which I think, for many of us, it seemed unthinkable even 5 years ago that this would be introduced in Congress. So I think there are foundations, but it's still very new in some ways, and it's hard to conceptualize. And I think we need to figure out first how to like get back our asylum system to the way it was. Two, try to figure out how to like pass an immigration bill if we can. And then third, I think integrate climate change, not just into the asylum framework, but like thinking more creatively than the asylum framework. Because I don't think it's just about having it as like another ground that is protected, but to think about visas or other ways in which people can maybe have more flexibility to move. Because again, not a lot of people don't want to come here the entire year and have to abandon their families and their culture and everything they know. So I just think we need more creativity and innovation in the space. So I welcome any ideas you may have.
Yeah, I feel like there's also openings just in the last like 2 or 3 years that didn't really exist before either. I mean, people have been putting their bodies on the line in trying to prevent deportations from ICE, even in communities like Bend, Oregon, which is not known as a progressive bastion or anything like that. People are standing up to defend against like ICE raids and things like that. You had the anti-police brutality protests going so strong last year, and frameworks around like defunding and desecuritizing that seem really easily translatable into the immigration and refugee and asylum context as well. So I don't know, at least in this realm, it feels like, I mean, you have a reaction to that, of course, too, which gets closer to like fascistic attitudes. So that has to be dealt with, but it does feel like people are advancing these the moral claims in a much stronger way than I ever remember, and at least more in the public limelight. Okay, another question here. This one is from Nina. Okay, it's a multi-part question, and you can look in the chat here to follow this one too, in case it gets lost. How do you and other folks working on climate migration both work on climate migration policies that center dignity and justice and hold space for the grief and injustice embedded in the reality of people being forced to leave home? Two, what are some of the effective ways you challenge the racist security discourse around climate migration in some of the more mainstream places where climate migration is just starting to get attention?
Oh. I'm on mute. got it. So for the first one, I haven't had, it's not like I have 10 years working in the space, right? So like, I don't know if I'm the best person to answer this question. There's folks who have worked with, refugee populations or immigrant populations much longer. But my sense, to your question is like, you listen to at least as a lawyer, you listen to your clients, you communicate with your clients, you don't like dumb down information, you don't like treat, you treat them as equal partners in like your fight for justice, their fight for justice at the end of the day. It's, and I think you don't disempower them, which I think is what happens. I mean, some people, I remember reading about folks, especially in like small island states, who actually hate the term climate refugee because they think it makes them look like a victim, and it like it like disempowers them, and they want to like have an active role in their liberation, right? Whether that's their decision or to move or not. And I think it happens a lot again with global north, global south dynamics, where like well-intended folks sometimes can talk about like people who are at the front line of climate impacts as if they're like, again, I think it has a lot of the like white supremacy and white savior tones, right? So I don't have a right answer for this except to like do this work with humility. At this right now, I'm not representing clients right now who are going through this, or who are bringing like climate migration claims. At this point, I'm just trying to do research and understand what's out there and what can we do about it. But that's only because right now my work is much more focused on like reading and understanding and analyzing. But at one point, I mean, I do think people are going to start bringing these claims, and if they're going to be brought in U.S. courts, then I think we need to push for policy changes or for like different guidance from like executive, from the executive. So like I think that's somewhat possible, like with maybe not this, I don't know if in the Biden administration, but definitely in the future. And it has to be, because it's happening, and it will only become more and more important. To your second question, it's a hard one. I think we just have to be careful, but also like explicit when we talk about it, and to name it, right? I think we have to name that the security discourse comes from a place, again, building on colonial legacies of like fear of people who are brown and black and Asian coming into our country. Like it's totally linked to like xenophobia and racism. And we've seen it, for instance, like I remember reading this in university, you know, like about the population bomb by like Maltas, and like no one taught, like we read it and that was it. Like we didn't talk about it as like, oh, actually, like, or like the tragedy of the commons by Hardin, who's actually been called like a white supremacist, right? And we read this, and that was our education, and we didn't talk about the ways in which like actually, like sure, like overpopulation is a concern at points, and we should talk about it, but not in those terms, and not through the lens of like a white man writing about people who are not controlling the reproductive system. You know, like it's just like really, it's loaded with so much violence, right? And so I think we name it. I think we name it, and we talk about climate migration as something that requires us to hold ourselves accountable. It requires us to act because of our historical contribution to greenhouse gas emission and the stabilization of economy of countries around the world. But I think it's not something we can do subtly. I don't think we can subtly call out systems of oppression, if that makes sense, right? Again, it depends where you're at and who you're meeting with. Like if you're meeting with someone in the administration, like you have to be strategic. I'm not saying go and tell them how racist and imperial the US government is, right? But when we are building narratives, which I think is what we're currently doing as a movement, as a Green New Deal, as a movement of people behind the Green New Deal, we have to name their narratives and name things as they are. I don't think we can hide away from just like the ugly reality of like systemic oppression and colonialism. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and it kind of also seems like that's maybe one of the lessons from the last, from the Obama era too, was like, we go slow, we go moderate, we try not to get things done, and then you still have a reaction and they just undo everything anyway. It's just like, well, may as well go for it. So this question from Natalia is really similar, but it's focused specifically on women's agency. So instead of focusing on women's agency, most discourses resort to a victim talk, highlighting vulnerability as the core aspect and perpetuating patriarchal stereotypes. How do you think the climate discourse could help advance a more agency-focused understanding of the role of women in facing climate change-related effects, particularly related to climate-induced migration?
This is a moment where I wish my like gender expert colleagues were here, so I could just be like please tell us like how to answer this really thoughtful question. But I also shy away from saying that because at least like in spaces where I used to work, like gender was this like thing that one person did. Like there was a gender expert, and like no one really thought about it, not like transversal, like I guess a cross-cutting thing that we should all think about. So actually I take that back. I don't actually know the answer to this question, except to say that, which I think I mentioned before, is like you bring in their voices instead of talking just about the vulnerability. I think it's hard because you wanna highlight the vulnerability, which is like a combination of their exposure to risk and the socioeconomic factors that are underlying, right? And at the same time, you wanna talk about the many structures, including gender, that like make, there's research on this, like how often women, in our paper, for instance, we talk about how like in some Central American countries, like a lot of the women who are indigenous only speak their indigenous language. And so for some of them, when there's like a particular disaster, they are not getting the information, or they might not be able to communicate in the same way because they don't speak Spanish, right? They speak their indigenous language. And so and for instance, it used to be a case, I think this has changed in recent years, but it used to be a case that it was mostly them who would stay behind, and the man in the family would go and like migrate and come to the United States, and then they would have to deal with like the entire labor of raising their children and providing for them. In terms of like climate discourse advancing a more agency focused understanding of the role of women, I almost feel like this is where like we want to talk about climate as an intersectional issue, and we don't want to talk about climate change through like the lens of like 1.5 degrees and like your hockey stick, and I think we're changing, and I think that's changing, and I've seen it in my young life, how the climate movement I think is heading or trying to head that way. But I think we talk about narratives, like we talk about people, we talk about stories about people, but we try to do it in a way that it's them telling the story whenever possible, right? So like in the Zoom, like yesterday I was at this wonderful event where one of my colleagues who's a student invited Jimmy, who's actually a trans activist who was detained during COVID because she's undocumented, and she organized like an amazing food, like hunger strike, when with everyone who was in this, like, again, incarcerated, so or detained, and so in very, very small space. Pandemic hits, cases rise, and they are just like, we're not gonna eat. Like, we're not gonna eat because you're not giving us toothpaste, you're not giving us soap, you're not giving us like toilet paper. And so and it was, I thought what was so awesome about that event was that the lawyer was there too, but Rachel, the lawyer, was answering questions, but Jimmy, it was them who were like answering most questions first and like telling their story, and then the lawyer who was like, okay, I can answer in some of the legal questions here. So I don't know, I really like that model where like it's not just like the lawyers telling things, and maybe I'm deviating a little bit from your question, and I'm just ranting now about the legal profession, but I think that you try to center the voices of the people who are suffering, and try to do it as carefully and tactfully as you can.
Yeah, and I know that Camila also has thought a lot about lawyering in a movement context as well, and so I don't know if I didn't ask her to prepare for that or anything like that, but if there's something later on that you want to say about that, feel free, Camila. Okay, here's a question. How can we make sure that our studies of climate migration don't end up enabling governments to just take displacement as a given and move straight to the large-scale resettlement programs, so they don't have to consider the systemic change that mitigation could prompt? It's a tough one.
I just don't think they would do that, because I think they already don't want to do that. Sorry, this is not a very articulate answer to your question, but my sense is that getting governments to accept migrants, refugees, whatever you want to call it, is already hard, increasingly hard, because of the sort of discourse that we've seen in the last 4 years and before, right? The discourse was here. It got worse under Trump. He didn't create it. And so, right, I mean, it's a little bit different now with Biden and the kind of political context we're in, but I just don't see a government being like, okay, climate change action. Actually, let's just focus on relocation and displacement. Like, we already have seen Australia not wanting to like receive a small number of people from nearby islands because of what it sets. It sets a precedent, and it's a recognition of we messed up. We've seen it in the international negotiations. Like, developed countries continue, like, keep showing up and saying, nope, no reparations. Actually, take that language out of the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much. We're not doing that, right? So, even though I think the point of the question is how do we actually get people to focus on mitigation and then maybe also immigration adaptation, I don't think it's going to happen because, again, because of the social context around it. That said, I mean, right now, I forget, I looked at these numbers a few years ago, but when you looked at international finance, it was like 70% or something that went to mitigation compared to 30% in adaptation. And maybe it was even, the gap might be even, like experts talk about the adaptation gap actually when compared to mitigation. So I think that it's not that I want us to only finance relocation and resettlement programs, but right now actually the gap operates the other way, where we might not see it, right? Because we're like, come on, like we haven't had like actual comprehensive climate change policy in this country. We tried, we almost had it, we didn't. But the reality is that when we talk about international finance and like climate aid, it's actually mostly going to mitigation, which is important. But if you're talking about a country like Colombia, obviously we have the Amazon, and so that's a huge source of emissions, and obviously has tons of like cultural and biological value, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, it's really, really vulnerable. So you cannot just focus on trying to stop deforestation, or trying to build like, I don't know, or trying to give clean, green electricity or clean electric vehicles, right? Which Thea talked about a lot last week. We have to talk about like helping people adapt and people be less vulnerable. And sometimes I think what's kind of sometimes counterintuitive, sometimes it's not about a climate response. It's not sometimes about building a wall, like a seawall, or building a particular infrastructure. Sometimes it's about like making people less socially and economically vulnerable, right? Because if you have like the networks, if you have the family ties, if you have someone that's going to call you in a heat wave, you're already in a much better place than someone who's isolated for some reason, because they're incredibly poor, because they live in a region where like the state is barely present, because you don't have the economic means to go into like an urban center, whatever it is. Like, so for me, it's like the economics of it are so central to the analysis that again, like we need to focus on helping people adapt before they even migrate, because in many cases that's not what should be happening.
Great answer. Pivoting a little bit here, this is Gladys. Do you see the transition into green energy in Latin America as having a positive impact on local economies and helping to improve the conditions in countries like Colombia?
I'm not an expert on this. What I will say, in Colombia, our two main exports are coal and oil. Let's start with that. There's been some developments in wind energy and solar, but as I understand it, right now it's not the priority of the government. So I don't even think we're there. And I do think that the problems with green energy is that what government, at least the Colombian one, is always talking about is like hydroelectric power, which we know also is like really bad because of methane emissions and because displacement it causes, right? Like often the government will like just like this forcibly displace a ton of people so they can like build a hydroelectric plant. And in Colombia recently, we had like some really, really tragic instances where like there were flaws in like the design and a lot of people died. So I'm gonna assume green energy doesn't mean hydro here, because that's a whole like other set of issues. But I think the problem is that also a lot of the green energy is being funded by China. And again, I have colleagues who are experts on this and I'm not. But the issue is that we're seeing like a new sort of dependent relationship form where like it's not the same countries, right? It's not European country, Western Europe, it's not Canada, it's not the US, but now it's China who's coming in and financing a lot of either these hydro plants or some of the renewable energy. And I think like, well, initially I'm like, yes, this is so much better than like continuing to like extract oil or like do fracking, which has obviously also been done in many places. It still doesn't, it still for me raises questions about like, what are the Chinese interests in like labor rights in Colombia, or like, right, or like health insurance for folks, or like pension pension for folks who are working in this industry. And like I for me the problem is like the economic asymmetry that then arises when you have a lot of capital coming in from, yes, a global south country in some ways, because China is still, like has still a lot of poverty, and there's still a lot of like development issues. But I'm really afraid in the direction that at least I've seen, because sometimes it's even harder to get like transparency on like how some of these projects are actually creating human rights abuses on the ground with Chinese companies. So that maybe your question was not necessarily about Chinese companies, but at least from my little experience on green energy in Colombia, it's not even that massive. And if it's happening, I sometimes wonder and have to question which are the economic interests behind it.
Okay. Another planned migration question from Tai. In thinking about planned migration, what structures are best positioned to engage these processes in just ways, and at what scales do you think it is critical to focus resources for planned migration? Very curious also how this could interact with simply removing barriers to migration.
I'm a little bit confused by what you mean by structures. Maybe you can clarify that in the chat, what scales. But in terms of scales, so we have to do this work, I think, across the scales. So internationally, because we know international law is really hard to change and sometimes hard to implement, but still useful. We still need to engage. And the Refugees International actually just released a report on this that I think was included in the readings, where they talk about the things that the Biden administration should do to re-engage with other countries that are like thinking and working through like this very same questions that we are talking about today, and like this international platforms that already exist to talk about migration. I think regionally there's like a lot that can be done. In Latin America, we actually have a more progressive sort of international law framework on migration and displacement through like the Cartagena Declaration. And I have a colleague at Columbia Law who's actually written on like Caribbean approaches or Caribbean lens to this question. So her name is Ama Francis. I invite you to read her work. So again, like we don't have to necessarily think just about the U.S. and Central America, or the U.S. and the global South, right? I think with regionally, there's ways in which it will be easier for folks in many ways to relocate because of things like language and just proximity to their home countries. If you're talking about within the U.S., very also curious about how to simply removing barriers to migration. Yeah, I mean, I think again, like I'm not an expert on open borders, but we are right now like talking about a platform that we're dreaming of, right? And not necessarily something that's just like what we had the last, or like during the Obama years. And part of me is like do it. Like we haven't tried that like in many ways. And actually there's like a brilliant economist, and his name is escaping me, but he wrote this book Utopia for Realists, and one of the chapters actually talks about open borders and why that isn't the scary thing we all think it is. And again, I'm not an expert on this, but go read him. He's like wonderful. But again, I think you're pointing at the right question, which is like, how can we reduce barriers to migration, or how can we allow for some like temporary migration where people can come in, work, be able to like send money to their families and then go back? Or what happens when an event, I mean, the problem with TPS, which is the current program that exists, that has been TPS status has been granted for folks who like are fleeing like earthquakes, the earthquake in Haiti, for instance, and the Hurricane Mitch in Central America, is that it's always been sort of like immediate, like under the emergency framework, and it hasn't been planned. But something like that in a larger scale that also accounts for slow onset events, and that protects people who are not just here, but who are still in the country dealing with the impacts of like a particular hurricane, like could work, right? And so I think we have to be creative about it. I think right now we're just so stuck in in this like really, really broken system that many people have talked about. Like the fact that we have 13 like million undocumented people in this country with like no status, but who have like either lived here for a really long time, bought houses, had their kids here, like are Americans in all the ways we can think of. It's just crazy and inhumane, and I think goes to show how like our current system is just so inflexible. And so I think we have to be creative about it, and try to like remove the barriers, and again, not necessarily provide like citizenship immediately to everyone who's displaced by a hurricane, but like definitely think about how is it that we can strengthen the economy in those countries so they don't have to live in the first place. How do we actually like build infrastructure in those places that helps people like, you know, not have to flee, but for those that do have to flee, how do we like allow them to come here with dignity and not have to suffer and live in the shadows as like 13 million documented people do, right? So because they're gonna come no matter what, and it doesn't matter how many walls we try to build. Like that's just not how it works. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about the open borders question and just like putting that trajectory in play, because like we do live in a world where travel has become really, really, really easy for just like a smaller amount of people who can pay to do it, right? Like people can go anywhere on tourism whenever they want to. Like you see Ted Cruz trying to escape Texas to just like go to Cancun and stuff. But like there's an infrastructure that was built over like 40 to 50 years that's basically allowing like specific financial or economic classes of people to move freely and to let capital move freely throughout the world. And that's corresponded with an increase in securitization of borders. And so why can't we imagine the inverse of that, right? Where like instead of sort of for fun and tourism that we allow that to, is the kind of like primary way that people get around and travel, that human needs were actually going to dictate people being able to move around. I don't know. I thought that last week Thea had some interesting stuff to say on that. If for folks are interested in going back and watching that one. And this comment from Nayeli is along with that. She says basically totally agree that borders shouldn't be seen as given and granted in the first place. Dismantling capitalism is not easy, but what the Green New Deal should aim for. So on a more hopeful note, I'm curious, how do you envision we could have a borderless world? And we've talked about this one a few times. If you want to take it on again, that's fine, but we can also move to another question.
This is a brilliant question, Nayeli. You tell me. How do we create a borderless world? Like this is no, but this is exactly right. I honestly, in full transparency, I think when I first heard about the concept, I was like, what? Like open borders? Like this seems terrifying. And then I think eventually doing like more reading and like critical thinking and like self questioning. Why am I so scared about the idea of opening a border? Why am I so scared of like uh yeah, of this like recent creation, right? It's like states are so new. Like I think we just forget that like states are really just a modern creation. But no, I mean I don't think I have brilliant answers to this except that we fight for that borderless world, and if not borderless, then a world that doesn't treat people the way it does because someone doesn't have a paper, like a piece of paper. Like it's just truly absurd. And currently our immigration system, it truly just benefits like whiteness and money, right? I tell this anecdotically, but I think it's true because some people don't know, but you know, I got to this country, I got a green card, I did it the right way, and it took my family 13 years. 13 years. And the only reason why we could do that is because my parents, we didn't have to flee immediately. Like we were okay in Colombia, we could wait the time, and then we could afford it. It's, and you know, anecdotically too, my partner is Colombian, and we got married a few years ago, and he now has a green card. Thousands of dollars, and I haven't even paid an immigration lawyer. I've just done it, we just done it ourselves, but just the fees. And so this idea that, you know, and you're not saying that of course, but again, I think it's just starting to think about the ways in which we are privileging whiteness and like money and wealth in our immigration system, and how do we like start to change that. I mean, I do think we need like systemic change, right? And I think most Americans actually agree with it, not with the open borders piece, but with the like immigration reform piece. So it's, to me, it's shocking that, you know, we weren't able to pass it during the Obama years, and that, well, we'll see what's going to happen in the next few months, right? That's kind of where we're going, hopefully. But I mean, talk about like a broken system.
And then we've got one more question, and folks, feel free, we've got about 15 minutes left if you want to add another last question or two. This one's from Tom. In terms of the migration to the United States context, some of the major asylum and refugee resettlement locations, Houston, Texas, Florida, for example, are also unfortunately having large climate impacts that are causing displacement. As we think about the overhaul of an asylum system, how do you think our asylum and refugee resettlement to deal with climate challenges that we may place them in when we bring them into the US? Stronger and longer hurricane seasons being an example.
I don't think I have an answer to this. I mean, that's the problem when you are in a warming world where climate is making every other place vulnerable. I think, not related to your question, but something that, you know, people talk about too is this idea that sometimes, you know, folks in countries will sometimes move from rural areas to urban areas first, and then they might, you know, or they might eventually just leave the country. But obviously there's tons of pull factors like more jobs, bigger job market in urban centers, and at the same time, like, they often move to the peripheries or to the favelas or to like the parts in the cities that are like most vulnerable. And so we've seen that in Colombia, for instance, like because of the amount of internal displacement, what has happened is that a ton of those people are now moving in like really precarious areas of the country. And again, they move because of violence, they move because of you know, death threats, they move because of the guerrillas, they move for a number of reasons, but they move to places that are more insecure, sometimes in terms of climate terms than where they come from. And I think your question is pointing to that. And I actually don't have an answer except to say that precisely that's why we need to like invest in mitigation, adaptation, and like climate migration plans, right? Like that's why there's it's not, we're locked into a level of warming that doesn't allow us to just focus on mitigation anymore. And I think this is why a lot of like people in the global south will tell you, it's like, please just like allow us, like, you know, give us finance, not just to like build, you know, solar panels and like windmills, like that's great, but like the reality is that for a lot of us, like, we contribute very little greenhouse gas emissions, and this is true for all Central American countries I've been talking about, not so much Colombia, but still true. And two, like we need to adapt. And so I don't know, I think you try to reduce climate vulnerability in places, but this is a great question.
So we have reached the end. Does anybody, if you've got any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I wanted to kind of like offer a space. You don't have to take it if you don't want to, but if there's anything that you did want to say, sort of like from a professional standpoint, in terms of somebody who's like, you know, planning a career and probably a lot of public service and working on these issues that you've thought about, like what you think that folks in the legal profession can offer to try to make a world a better place and how to do that.
These easy questions. These questions are so easy.
Well, this is the last time you ever come to a brief.
Wow, that's a $1 million question. I mean, from my little exposure to the legal world, I will say humility, number one. I think lawyers have huge egos, and I actually think that's part of a lot of the problem, that we come from a place of expertise, from technocracy almost, right? Or technocratic approaches, because that's what the law is. You have to be good. And I'm not saying, and no one wants a lousy lawyer. I had a professor tell me that once, like, no one wants a lousy lawyer. That's the first thing, like, be a good lawyer, which obviously is true. But beyond, you know, being able to do the legal skills, whether that's arguing in court, like oral advocacy, or just like the research and the writing, I think we need to come to a place where we understand that we are literally just like here to serve people. I think, especially those of us who want to work in public interest, and that we're not smarter and we're not like the experts. Like it's just so funny. Like through my my short-lived experience, as soon as I entered Yale Law School, the amount of people who immediately assume I was smarter, I was better, I had the right answers. It's just absurd. And again, of course, it's given me a lot of opportunities, and I'm looking forward to graduating and entering the workforce. But yeah, I think we need humility, number one. And I think related to that, which is something I mentioned that was brought up yesterday in the panel I discussed. Someone in the class asked Jimmy, the activist I mentioned, Jimmy, what should future lawyers know or do, or for those of us who want to work in solidarity with movements, how should we do that? And Jimmy's answer, Jimmy was like they were just so confused, because they were just like, oh well, I mean, just talk to your clients, like work with them, collaborate. Like it was just such a like obvious answer to them, right? That it was like, well, what my lawyer does that I like is that she comes here, she explains to me what's up, she keeps me updated, and then she asks me what I think and what I think we should do, and then we collaborate and we come up with an answer together. And I was like, oh, okay, that's not, and I don't know, and it was just so beautifully, it's just so articulated so clearly. So I think we need to do more of that, and I think it's hard because the systems are made up so that we are in a space of privilege and elite and economic access, and people listen to our voices, and the clients that we usually work for, the communities that we work for, don't have access to any of that. And so inevitably we enter into an asymmetrical relationship with our clients or communities that we want to work with. So I think we just have to be honest about that, like not hide away, not feel guilty, but like interrogate that and use that, in a way that hopefully helps people. Is that too cheesy?
No, it's great. I love the sentiment. And, I'm really excited that you're going to be entering the movement as a lawyer soon. I think you're going to do amazing things. This was really awesome, Camila. Thank you so much for your time. It looks like we've run dry of questions. We've already just figured out how to create a open bordered world. So, I'm not sure that there's more we can answer after that. Yeah, thanks again. And for folks that do you have any kind of like place where you're publishing or where folks can follow you if they want to keep apprised of your thoughts and where you're going?
Follow me on Twitter. That's where I share cute photos of my dog and my hot takes on climate and immigration issues. The other thing I'm just gonna use this 5 minutes that we have left just to do another plug for a project that I'm involved in, that maybe given the audience you might be interested in, Law Students for Climate Accountability. We co-founded this organization with some colleagues from Yale, but now it's actually like I think a national organization because we have law students from all across the country. Essentially like demanding and pushing the legal industry to be accountable for its role in the climate crisis. I think lawyers, I think we're so late in this conversation. I mean, I'm not even a lawyer yet, but like we're just so late in the conversation. Like I remember like entering Yale Law School and like only a few people wanted to do climate work. And I was like, what's happening? Like, this is not, I mean, I think it's actually surprising. It's like the number of people who are interested has tripled, but anyways, and firms are a huge part of that. And so actually our project has been to like put more transparency in what, how they're like helping the fossil fuel industry, like by doing transactional work, litigation work, and lobbying work. So I just wanted to put a plug for that and check us out. We're also on Twitter, Law Students for Climate Accountability. And I think we're just starting, hopefully. Like there's many ways to try to push for that. So I'll end with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And for folks that are going to continue following with this course, next week we've got Green New Deal Economics with Mitch Green on Wednesday, and then a special session on Thursday with a speaker called Justine Burt, who's going to talk to us about some of her financing ideas in a book that she wrote. So thanks everybody for joining. If you've got any comments, questions, feel free to email them to me, and otherwise, yeah, we'll see you soon. Thank you again, Camila, and yeah, everyone have a great one. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.